B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, June 16th, 2020. There's a lot of momentum and energy behind significant police reform across the United States these days. And there are also some people who are faking it. Let's see if we can help understand the difference. So today, Donald Trump held a photo op executive order signing. You know how he loves to do it. Staged with human wallpaper behind him. And today's wallpaper was police officials as he signed his executive order that he calls police reform. And it is a watered-down effort, and some of that is the limited authority that the federal government has over local police operations. But this is intentionally weak. And while it does order an end to the use of chokeholds, there's a huge exception. It says state or local law enforcement agencies' use of force policies should prohibit the use of chokeholds except in those situations where the use of deadly force is allowed by law. And it's those kinds of weasel words that you have to be looking for when you read accounts about different efforts at police reform. What are the loopholes? What is the enforceability of the measure that is embodied in this official action? Well, Democrats immediately slammed it as too little. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, while the president has finally acknowledged the need for policing reform, one modest executive order will not make up for his years of inflammatory rhetoric and policies designed to roll back the progress made in previous years. Ultimately, this executive order will not deliver the comprehensive, meaningful change and accountability in our nation's police departments that Americans are demanding. Speaker Pelosi. This order falls sadly and seriously short of what is required to combat the epidemic of racial injustice and police brutality that is murdering hundreds of black Americans. The executive order lacks meaningful mandatory accountability measures to end misconduct. During this moment of national anguish, we must insist on bold change, not meekly surrender to the bare minimum. Democrats urge congressional Republicans and the White House to join us to support real change. Now, some of that's just political rhetoric. I saw a post online last night where Nancy Pelosi was asked if she had any regrets about her support for Joe Biden and Bill Clinton's 1994 crime bills. And she said no. So we have to be skeptical of all parties to this effort. And I want to credit The Intercept for an enlightening piece. They report the fact that New York City's police department announced yesterday that it is disbanding a hyper-aggressive and notoriously trigger-happy plainclothes unit. A majority of the 600 officers in the department's anti-crime units will immediately be moved to other assignments. The reassigned officers will take up positions in the Detectives Bureau and the department's community policing efforts, according to Police Commissioner Dermot Shea. But when you talk to the reformers, like Munifa Bondella, Vice President of Criminal Justice Campaigns at Moms Rising, and a member of the policy leadership team for the Movement for Black Lives, she called the move a shell game and a distraction aimed at diverting New Yorkers' attention from growing calls to defund the NYPD. Quote, "It's moving around resources and actual police officers, shuffling them around within the department to make it look like what we're asking for, but we're actually calling for a much larger systemic shift. We're not talking about shuffling resources and people within the department. We're talking about moving around resources within the citywide budget in a way that makes our communities safer. That means actually moving money out of NYPD and moving those resources into education, housing, mental health services, homeless services. She says internal personnel changes don't really address the fact that our communities are over-policed and under-resourced. And then they quote Albert Kahn, and I've put a link in the show file to my podcast interview with Mr. Kahn from a couple of years ago. He's the director of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. And when I interviewed him, I think it was last year, yes it was, in September, about the Proud Boys case, where the NYPD used reverse search warrants that were served on Google and other tech companies, trying to use their massive collection of data to map the movements of the Proud Boys who got into a street skirmish with Antifa. So Kahn is quoted here saying, they tried this same tactic before. It's simply an easy way for them to take a page out of the NYPD PR handbook and avoid real structural reform. And if these officers are simply doubling down on the NYPD bias and broken surveillance of communities of color, it's going to result in more police violence. He continued, I've seen this cycle play out before, where you have outrage, then the NYPD claims it will fix it, and then, he said, they do a mild change. In the Senate, Tim Scott, the only black Republican from South Carolina, he promises that he's going to get a bill passed that actually becomes law, and it will include a ban on the chokehold. Well, I appreciate his optimism. But let's see what happens when Papa Mitch and some of the hardline right-wingers in the Senate get a hold of this and what kind of amendments and loopholes they can add to the mix. Then we have here in California, Attorney General Javier Becerra, a man who I talked to when he was a member of Congress. He succeeded Kamala Harris as the Attorney General, and I generally admire Mr. Becerra. My biggest criticism is that he has been very slow and obstructive in implementing a state law passed a year and a half ago that requires access to the personnel files of police officers when they are known to have violated policies or the law. Well, he's now saying that he wants legislation that would help decertify police officers for serious misconduct. And I certainly think this is a good idea, but I have to question his sincerity and his determination. As he says, we're pushing ahead on significant plans to support or sponsor legislation that works to decertify police officers for serious misconduct. And California is one of just 5 states that doesn't operate a statewide system to decertify bad cops. The others are Rhode Island, Hawaii, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. And I mentioned yesterday that the 3 big police unions in California, San Francisco, San Jose, Los Angeles, have just changed their tune and their colors. They're saying they want to work together for serious police reform. Well, I do not consider that to be a reliable commitment. And to the Attorney General, Mr. Becerra, I say my mind is open, but you're going to have to prove your commitment and your determination, and then you're going to have to follow through. Not just put laws on the books, but actually enforce them. And in an exchange on Facebook over the weekend, I developed an idea. It's probably not original, but someone who I like had posted the idea that we should dip into police officers' pension funds when we have to pay out these multi-million-dollar settlements to the families of people who've been brutalized or killed by police officers. And I don't believe that it's fair to penalize the entire group, a collective punishment, in that manner, and it's probably not legal to divert their pension money in that manner. But it inspired me to suggest that we should require that police officers carry their own insurance policy. Many professionals, psychologists, accountants, lots of self-employed people carry what's called errors and omissions coverage. Sometimes it's included in the umbrella coverage of a homeowner's policy. Other times it is written as a separate bit of insurance coverage. And if a cop has to pay for his or her own coverage, let's say we set a minimum of $10 million in liability coverage. Well, the for-profit insurance companies are going to scrutinize them carefully, and they're going to demand to be able to see any kind of disciplinary action or other reports of bad behavior from that officer before they write the insurance policy. And as demerits are racked up, the cost of the insurance increases. And when the offenses are serious or there's a pattern of offenses, they are threatened with loss of coverage or rates that are so high that they can't afford to continue in the profession. We apply those standards to all kinds of people, and I say, why not the cops? And here's a bit of a reality check from France. Because just recently, after 2 weeks of protests in France over the George Floyd murder, the Interior Minister announced that French police would be banned from using the chokehold. And then the gendarmes started marching and protesting themselves. And today we get news from The Guardian that France has reversed its ban on police using the chokehold. We must be prepared for this kind of action from our own ranks of police officers in this country. And there's a story out of Minneapolis of one of the members of the city council who had criticized the police. I don't remember the particulars. All of a sudden, response times in that council person's district went way, way up. And the cops sent a message when people complained, hey, you reported 45 minutes after I called in a shoplifting complaint. And the cops would say, well, talk to council member so-and-so. And it's that kind of insidious abuse of their authority and slowdowns that we can expect when the cops decide to fight back. Here in California, I reported yesterday on this one African-American man who was found hanging from a tree in Palmdale. And the initial authority report was that it was a suicide. No indications that he did it all by himself. So now that is being investigated as a lynching. And there was a separate incident on May 31st in Victorville, where 38-year-old Malcolm Harsh was found swinging from a tree. It was also declared a suicide initially. So now the FBI and Department of Justice, which I don't get much are reviewing these investigations. The aforementioned Attorney General Javier Becerra said that his office is independently monitoring and assessing the investigation. So these two incidents occurred 10 days apart and about 50 miles apart. And they certainly look like lynchings to me. Now, in the case for the first time here, the man named Harsh, H-A-R-S-C-H, the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office said they got a 911 call from the man's girlfriend on May 31st that he had hanged himself at a homeless encampment in Victorville. She said that she and Harsh were together in the morning, but she'd returned to her tent when others in the encampment informed her that Harsh had been found hanging from a tree. So these appear to be highly suspicious. I don't have more details or evidence to share with you at this point. But there is an interesting detail that has been reported by the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama. Their researchers have documented that since the end of the Civil War and up through 1950, they have documented 6,500 lynchings, including 2,000 that occurred during Reconstruction that were not included in its previous reports. And if you haven't seen it yet, there's a movie streaming at Netflix, and I think is a Google+. It's called Just Mercy. And it profiles the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, who was trained in law at Harvard and moved to Alabama to take on very unpopular death row cases. The lawyer is played by Michael B. Jordan. He does a great job. And Jamie Foxx is one of the death row prisoners. And as somebody who has fought unjust convictions over the years, even for a Hollywood film, I can't vouch that every detail is accurate, but it is a moving portrayal of efforts to bring justice to men who have been condemned to in the cesspool of justice that we call Alabama. So last night in Albuquerque, there was a protest, and a group of people wanted to tear down a statue or monument to the Spanish conquistador Juan de Oñate. And he is considered to be a brutal, I think he was a slave owner and considered to be a very nasty man. And there was a group of self-styled militia who were there, and they claim that the man who actually started firing on one of the protesters, now identified as Stephen Baca, age 31, was not one of their members. He was just a vigilante showing up with these other self-styled militia vigilantes. They were there to protect the statue, and I haven't seen any video on this, so I hesitate to share what I consider to be confusing details. But the description, according to the Washington Post, is that one of the protesters went after Baca because he was armed and swung a 2x4 at him. And Baca, he was injured but didn't die. And then he started pepper spraying other protesters who kind of piled on. And number one, I have to say that I have limited support for mob justice against statues and other commemorations of bad people, because our history is so loaded with bad actors, people who were slave owners, who were brutal to Native Americans, who exploited women. It becomes so difficult to know where to draw the line. And so if I had to draw the line, I guess I would, end at the Civil War. And here in my community, a woman has gathered 5,000 signatures to remove what is how can I put it? It's a modernist, kind of impressionist statue, Francis Drake, who is credited with landing in the Point Reyes area along the California coast here in Marin County in the 16th century. And I did a quick lookup of Sir Francis Drake. I've never paid much attention to him. I knew he was an explorer, and he was credited with discovering for Europe this part of California. And so where do we stop? I'm not trying to in any way justify the history of Sir Francis Drake. But we've got a road named after him. There's Drake's Estero. There is a local high school. And is that as offensive? We had a big controversy that blew up into national coverage here, where the Dixie School District and the Dixie School went through a whole process over a year or more and finally changed their name to from Dixie to Miller Creek. And now we've got to look at Miller, right? So I just feel that up to a point, this can become excessive. And I don't know that trying to sanitize our history is actually a real service to future generations. I have no problem putting up a plaque that says, here is the honoring of an evil man. Read the history before you decide to embrace his or her legacy. But I just don't know where it all ends. And I do understand that symbolism, that naming military bases in the South for Confederate generals and officers is offensive to many people. And that's why I kind of suggest that the cutoff point should be the American Civil War. Just a brief update on the situation in Seattle from everything I've read. Chaz, the occupied zone there on Capitol Hill, remains unmolested. There have been threats that Boogaloo Boys or others were heading there with their guns. And so far, I'm glad to see that there has been no incident that's been reported. The former Atlanta police officer, the guy who fatally shot Rayshard Brooks, his name is Garrett Rolfe, and he was fired shortly after the incident Friday night at the Wendy's in Atlanta. Well, now we have gotten some access. We know what is in his file, but the details of the documents have not been released. He was issued a written reprimand in 2016 for a different use of force incident involving the use of a firearm. That's all that's all that's been revealed so far. But his file also includes 4 other citizen complaints, which resulted in no disciplinary action, and 5 vehicle accidents. He got an oral admonishment in 2014 for his driving and crashing, and a written reprimand in 2018. So in the 2015 episode, oh, wait a minute. So we don't have details of the 2016 use of force. And then in August of 2015, there was an episode involving the discharge of a firearm. But no disciplinary action was taken in that case. So this guy's been a hothead for a while. And if the public had access to the files of bad police officers, well, we'd all be better off, and maybe they should look for other lines of work. I was pretty impressed last night when I watched The Daily Show, and Trevor Noah, who's only been in the United States, 4 or 5 years now? He is so well steeped in our history and in the kind of nuances of American culture. And I give him a lot of credit because he concluded that the killing of Rayshard Brooks was wrong. But he also was honest about how messy the case was. That Brooks was asleep in his car in the drive-through lane. That he failed the field sobriety test. And that there was what appeared to be a respectful exchange between him and the 2 officers until the first cuff went on, and that's when the video from the body cam shows that he started fighting with the cops. And he referred to it as messy. And it's true. And I will repeat that I don't believe that the killing of Rayshard Brooks is justified. But you also can't just turn him into an instant saint because of the details of the altercation and the interaction he had with the police. New details from a 9/11 dispatcher in Minneapolis. Back on May 25th, the now infamous incident where Derek Chauvin put his knee on the neck of George Floyd and didn't let up until he was dead. Well, a 911 dispatcher went to her supervisor, and she said to him or her, "You can call me a snitch if you want to, but we have the cameras up for the incident. It was Squad 320. I don't know if they had to use force or not. They got something out of the back of the squad, and all of them sat on this man, so I don't know if they needed to or not, but they haven't said anything to me yet. Department policy requires officers to notify a supervisor when force is used, with some exceptions like a takedown technique. But under department rules, in uses of force, a supervisor should go to the scene to review the incident." Now, we don't know the name of this supervisor, but he or she responded to the dispatcher that the officers hadn't said anything to him, just a takedown, which doesn't count, adding that he'd find out what was going on. And the dispatcher, apparently backing down, said, "No problem. We don't get to ever see it, so when we see it, we're just like, well, that looks a little different." Then there were 2 calls from witnesses at the scene. Bystanders called in to say, "We just watched officer number 987 kill a citizen in front of a Chicago store. He just pretty much killed this guy that wasn't resisting arrest." The caller said they weren't sure if Floyd was dead, but that he was unresponsive when the paramedics arrived. A second caller, who identified himself as an off-duty first responder, said the officers didn't make any attempts to save Floyd's life. Quote, "I literally watched police officers not take a pulse, not do anything to save a man. I just happened to be on a walk, so this dude, they fucking killed him." End quote. And now we learn from the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, a case that goes back a couple of weeks. A pastor named Leon McCrae Sr. owns some property in Edinburgh, Virginia. Sounds like a small apartment building. So he went to visit the place when he saw 2 people who didn't live there dragging a refrigerator to a dumpster behind his apartment building. And when he asked them to leave because they were trespassing, they were apparently white, he said they started threatening him and brought 3 other people who circled around him. "They were telling me that my Black Life and Black Lives Matter stuff, that they don't give a darn about that stuff in this county and they could care less, and we will kill you," McCrae reported. So he pulled out his licensed concealed gun, feeling threatened by the group, and he called 911 for assistance. And when the cops arrived, deputy sheriffs on the scene, they asked him to hand over his gun before talking to the group of 5 people who he said had threatened him. But McCrae said the deputies never let him give his story. "They came back to me and said, 'We have to arrest you for brandishing a firearm.' They put me in handcuffs," McCrae said. The pastor said that when deputies placed him in the car, the 5 people who'd been threatening him waved at the vehicle and kept yelling racial epithets as he was driven off. Now, the sheriff has apologized, said he was upset with his deputies over the arrest. McCrae was defending himself. "I believe McCrae," said the sheriff. But it shows just how deep the racism runs. And this was not a Karen case, at least as far as I know. Couple of interesting and thought-provoking commentaries. Jerry Frazia shared with me this article at Counterpunch by Rob Uri, and he goes into some of the history of police brutality, argues that it is often class-based, He said the disproportionate targeting of blacks by police is given needed context when you look at the data organized by class. Poor and working class whites are arrested and incarcerated at about the same rate as poor and working class blacks. By its nature, this data says nothing about the history, but it does offer structural and political insights. He says the current focus on police violence is roughly analogous to explaining foreign entanglements like wars through the actions of foot soldiers and technicians, rather than through the strategic and tactical goals of state leaders. And explanations of police power, like police unions and white supremacy, ignore modern history at the peril of their purveyors. And he goes into the criminalization, the expansion of the prison system, the carceral state, under President Richard Nixon, and that Nixon understood that crime related to drugs was a political designation intended to put the entire counterculture, which included a large black nationalist movement at the time, in prison. And I agree that the war on some drugs has been a big driver of race and class-based injustice in this country. And he said that reforms will only be adopted and kept in place as long as the broader political and economic goals of the oligarchs are met. For instance, the New Deal was jettisoned the moment it could be plausibly argued that it constrained capital. And the Voting Rights Act, after blacks were given the right to vote, capital took over the electoral system. So it's an interesting piece, well argued. I've got a link to it in the show file for today's podcast at peterbcollins.com. And my pal, buddy, Pepe Escobar weighed in with an interesting column where he talks about Chaz, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle. And he notes the threats from Trump to take charge if he has to break it up. And he says shades of Syria in Seattle are visibly discernible. Under this scenario, the commune is a remixed Idlib-fighting regime insurgency outposts. He says, so when will the regime forces strike? In this case, without Russian air cover. You can tell his tongue is in cheek. After all, as dictated by Defense Secretary Esper, it's up to the Pentagon to dominate the battlefield. So it's an interesting piece. Always colorful language used by Mr. Escobar. And he compares the Black Lives Matter movement to the Black Panthers. And I think you'll find that part very interesting. The biggest takeaway that I didn't know about is the amount of money that is flowing into the movement for Black lives. And it's coming from major corporate entities. And that's where Pepe argues that Black Lives Matter, as an organization, as a movement, in many ways doesn't have the impact that the Black Panthers did in the 1960s here in the United States. And then BuzzFeed did an investigation, and there is a separate Black Lives Matter Foundation. It's run by a single guy. It's based in Santa Clarita, which is in the northern end of Los Angeles County. And a lot of people have been donating money to it because they figure it is the official foundation of the movement for Black lives. But the entity was formed in 2015. It is a valid California nonprofit. But it has a very different goal. It's to bring the community and the police closer together. And big companies like Apple, Google, Microsoft raised $4 million and almost delivered the money to this group until they got wise that it is the brainchild of a single guy named Robert Barnes. And he told BuzzFeed, our whole thing is having unity with the police department. And Barnes has some basis for this. He says, look, I started this. It appears that the money raised, not all of it delivered, was over $4 million. through the first few weeks of June. And Barnes said, look, I have the right to use the name Black Lives Matter. I filed for this in California in 2015. He is a 67-year-old music producer from L.A., defended his organization. He said no one owns the concept. And he said his life has been tainted by painful experiences with the police, including the 2011 death of his wife's ex-husband, he says, at the hands of the L.A. Police Department. But the official group of the official name of the movement for Black Lives is the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, Incorporated. But it is not a nonprofit, and the foundation is. So the confusion, in some ways, is self-inflicted, and this guy Barnes has his own entity, his own agenda, and it appears that many people are donating to his nonprofit thinking that they are helping the original organization. I want to mention to listeners that I haven't recently been able to record any fresh, in-depth interviews. And it's because my schedule has been impacted by my partner Kathy's recent surgery. She had her shoulder operated on for a bicep and rotator cuff repair, and she's not supposed to drive. It doesn't mean she doesn't, but I do try to drive her when she needs to go to physical therapy appointments. And so I was at one today, and it delayed the start of my whole work cycle here for the podcast. And I hope to resume those in-depth interviews within the next week or so. Late yesterday, I did sit for a conversation with my old friend Aldous Tyler. Aldous is an independent media guy based in Madison, Wisconsin, and he has the original TMI for Too Much Information. And we spent an hour talking about the Black Lives Matter protests, about media malpractice, and a lot of other stuff that you hear me talk about on a regular basis here on the podcast. And you can find that at tmi.com. There's also a link for it in the show file for today's podcast here at peterbcollins.com. Now, as you know, we are still offering $100 grants from the Peter B. Collins Podcast Community Fund. Listeners who subscribe and some others made some substantial donations to our fund, and I have kicked in all of the proceeds from subscriptions starting on April 15th and ending yesterday. And Linda Lewis, who edits our daily COVID-19 update, that's coming up in a second here, she referred the Mosleys to me. A.J. Mosley is a young man living in Fort Worth, Texas. He and his girlfriend moved into their first apartment back in February. Then A.J. started having some seizures. He went to the hospital. They told him that he couldn't drive. He couldn't run the forklift that he operated at work, so he had to take off from his job. And then COVID-19 hit. They postponed his medical appointments for 3 months to deal with the seizures. And he's found a temporary job at Jiffy Lube, but he doesn't have health insurance, can't afford to see the doctor now. And to add insult to those injuries, he has been paying something for his rent every month but can't afford the full amount. And today he got a call from the apartment manager and was told that he will be getting an eviction notice. So, AJ, I am sending you a check today in the mail, a grant from the community fund here, and I'm going to put in a little more than $100 because he is behind on rent to the tune of $2,000, and his $1,000 rent payment for July 1st is quickly approaching. And if any listeners are moved to provide direct help to A.J. Mosley, just email Peter at peterbcollins.com, and let's see if we can help him get back ahead of the curve here. And if you're so inclined, You can contribute additional funds of any amount, and I will make sure that that gets earmarked and delivered to AJ at this difficult time that he is facing. And one more item here. I want to give a shout out to one of our longest and most loyal listeners and subscribers, Terry Paris. She just completed spine surgery. It was a week ago. We understand that she is doing well and that she's kind of ahead of the recovery plan. And she just started to get back into the groove of listening to podcasts. So, Terry, we're all thinking of you and hope that you have a quick and full recovery. Any kind of spinal surgery, that's pretty serious in my book. And I hope that it relieves the pain or other ailments that you had before the surgery. Now to today's COVID-19 update, thanks to Linda Lewis. The worldwide case count is over 8 million, with 439,000 deaths reported. In the U.S., 2.1 million cases with 116,700 deaths reported. Brazil has 888,000 cases, and they're approaching 43,000 deaths at this point. So the Washington Post reported yesterday that at least 10 states in the U.S. have seen an increase of 10% or more of new COVID-19 cases since Memorial Day 3 weeks ago. Officials are currently tracking about 20,000 cases a day, roughly 1,000 fatalities per day nationwide. The new cases are climbing in the nation's south and southwest, record case numbers in Alabama and South Carolina as well. The Institute for Health Metrics at the University of Washington, which has been providing some of the most reliable data to the extent that it can be considered reliable, they now project more than 200,000 Americans could die by as soon as October 1st. And the prediction went up by more than 30,000 since last week. And they say that rising mobility and premature relaxation of social distancing are the main reasons for the projected increase. There is a new inexpensive drug that is showing some promise, and it's an existing drug. I shouldn't have described it as new. It's a low-cost steroid medication called dexamethasone. And according to a new study, it has reduced deaths among 6,000 patients who participated in a trial in the United Kingdom. The drug reduced deaths by a third in patients receiving ventilation, by 1/5 in patients receiving only oxygen treatment. No benefit was observed for patients who didn't need respiratory support. So this is promising. The government started stockpiling dexamethasone several months ago, and they have 200,000 doses on hand. That is in Britain. And our friend Paul Leto up in the Seattle area sent me a couple of messages. Dexamethasone, he did some research, is a strong form of prednisone, about 6 times stronger. A group of doctors previously testified to Congress that they saved 98 of 100 critical care patients with prednisone, vitamin C, and heparin, all cheap or generic, and that this has been ignored. He cites the May 7th testimony to the Senate of a doctor. Note that he says the virus doesn't kill anybody, it's the inflammation that does, and prednisone and dexamethasone battle inflammation as steroids. It also states that the CDC and the NIH are much more interested in the antiviral and vaccine therapies than they are in cheap therapies that save lives at critical stages. The health authorities specifically warned against off-label use of corticosteroids, even though off-label use is something that doctors do almost every day. And he notes, or this is his view, that there's been an effort to suppress cheap and effective therapies, presumably in favor of a big pharma payday, even though this is costing many lives. Paul, thank you for the research and your comment there. Mental health experts are concerned about pandemic fatigue. As restrictions relax and many people become less vigilant about washing their hands, wearing masks, and maintaining physical distance. Mike Pence, who plays vice president in this soap opera, was quoted in a leaked audio obtained by the New York Times as he encouraged governors to repeat a misleading claim by Trump that new outbreaks and climbing numbers are the result of increased testing. Quoting from Pence, "I would just encourage you, as we talk about these things, to make sure to continue to explain to your citizens the magnitude of increase in testing, and that in most of the cases where we're seeing some marginal rise in number, that's more a result of the extraordinary work you're doing." Now, the only problem with this is that it's not really true. He says, also encourage people with the news that we are safely reopening the country, that as we speak today, because people are going back to hospitals and elective surgery, getting ordinary care, hospitalization rates may be going up. Well, that's just bullshit. Nobody's counting people who go in for back surgery like Terry Paris as a COVID case, filling up a hospital bed. And this echoes what Trump was saying at the very beginning of this cycle, when the Grand Princess was languishing off the coast of San Francisco. And there was a struggle between Governor Newsom and the White House. Trump didn't want them to come ashore because it was going to make the numbers go up. The humans, the death toll, it's not as critical as the numbers. Linda notes that the news outlet Vox has a clearer than most discussion of the threat of a second wave. The U.S. is in a much different place than it was at the start of the pandemic. The U.S. is now the epicenter of COVID-19 with 2 million confirmed cases and 118,000 deaths. A reimposition of shutdown measures at this point, if they were obeyed, would still reduce the number of new infections, but that would be in proportion to a higher baseline. New cases would drop, but it would take much longer to reach the level seen after the first round of shutdowns. When starting from a higher number of cases, there is more transmission baked in. For instance, there will likely be more cases of household spread among family members under a stay-at-home order. And when there are a higher number of overall infections, there are likely to be even more undetected infections that may continue to worsen the pandemic. And Linda adds, the baseline number is very important to understanding the concerns of epidemiologists. For the same reason that investing $500 at 8% interest will get you to your goal much faster than investing only $5, failing to take precautions when the number of active cases is high will generate a higher number of new cases over the same amount of time than we witnessed when the initial number was much smaller. And another quote from Vox here, perhaps the biggest unknown for a second shutdown is how well people would adhere to the orders. In Latin America, the coronavirus crisis is pushing 40 million people into food insecurity. This is a warning from the United Nations today, calling for urgent action to avert a hunger pandemic. And finally, in Linda's summary today, we did report to you a few weeks back that because of the meatpacking plants facing outbreaks of worker cases and workers testing positive, they told us that this is an essential industry and that shipments of meat products would decline and prices would go up if they were unable to force their workers to report for duty. And this led Trump to invoke, after he had avoided it, the Defense Production Act, ordering the meatpacking plants to remain open. And now we learn that during the month of April, when they were telling us all this, Smithfield, one of the biggest slaughterhouses that's owned by a Chinese company, sent 9,000 tons of pork to China. Tyson, American-owned, exported 1,289 tons of pork to China. The total export amounted to 129,000 tons at the same time that we were being told that shortages were developing and that we had to potentially sacrifice the health of workers in order to keep Americans fed. I'm a little dubious about this rush to a vaccine. In fact, I'm a lot dubious, and I'll tell you that I will not be one of the first to allow them to jab me with it. But our beneficent dear tweeter has pledged that when the vaccine, or if the vaccine, is ready for distribution, that it will be given free to vulnerable Americans unable to afford it. Now, this seems to warn us that the profiteering may be really egregious, said a Trump administration official. For any American who's vulnerable, who cannot afford the vaccines and desires the vaccine, we will provide it for free. And they are going to use a tiered approach for distribution, making sure that people like elderly Americans, those with pre-existing conditions, they will get first priority. Well, I hope they don't wind up being first in line for a pharmaceutical termination. You know, the death panels that Sarah Palin warned us about. Meanwhile, in Oklahoma, caseloads continue to climb. 591 new cases reported yesterday. That's a 7.7% increase, the highest rate of increase in the United States. And this is ahead of the Trump rally that we're told over 1 million people requested tickets for in Tulsa. And people are going to get hand sanitizer as they enter the arena. They're going to be offered masks, but of course there will be a lot of peer pressure not to put them on. And they're going to jam 19,000 people in one arena. They're thinking about renting a nearby conference center, a convention center, that would increase the capacity by another 40,000. I mean, do 40,000 people want to jam into a convention center to watch Trump on a big screen TV? I mean, you got to really be dying to support your man, your fearless leader, to take a risk like that. We have border skirmishes to report. First up, between India and China. 20 Indian Army troops were killed by Chinese soldiers late Monday in a clash along the disputed India-China border. And get this, the fight broke out man-to-man. I believe they have plenty of weapons, but the description is that the soldiers had been killed in a brawl involving rocks and wooden clubs. It was similar to fights that broke out last month along the border and seriously injured several soldiers on both sides. An Indian military spokesman said that 3 troops were killed during the fighting. 17 others later died from injuries. And India reported that several Chinese soldiers had been killed, but China is not confirming that so far. The other place with serious border tensions is the 38th parallel, the DMV between South and North Korea. And in quite a statement, North Korea today blew up a building where its officials and their South Korean counterparts had recently worked side by side. This is a building that had been erected, a 4-story building, to house the efforts to pursue peace that Kim and Trump were meeting about, the meetings that have really produced no results, although there's no indication that North Korea has continued developing nuclear weapons. On June 5th, the North threatened to close down this building. 4 days later, it cut off all communication with the South, including a line that went through the liaison office that we're talking about, and then they completely demolished it. Earlier today, depending on what side of the date line you're on. Steny Hoyer is the House majority leader. He is a Democrat from Maryland, and he has long opposed statehood for the District of Columbia. But today he announced that on June 26th, the House will hold the first floor vote on a bill authorizing statehood for the district. So I commend him for changing. He's now on the right side. And I believe that D.C. and Puerto Rico have long deserved statehood. But because each of those territories, if you will, have large Democratic populations, the Republicans who control the Senate don't even want to think about it. There are 40 Democratic senators who are on board supporting statehood for the district, but Mitch McConnell said that it will not get a vote as long as he is running the Senate. So I think that this is a worthy endeavor. And Hoyer now says there's no doubt in my mind if this were a Republican city and a white city, that statehood would have happened a long time ago. And we have news that House Democrats are issuing subpoenas to Aaron Zelinsky. He was a member of the Bob Mueller investigative team. He was handed the Roger Stone prosecution as Mueller wound down his investigation. And he has been asked to testify on June 24th about Attorney General Bill Barr's intervention demanding a lighter sentence recommendation for Trump's pal, Roger Stone. They've also issued a subpoena to a guy named John Elias, who is a Justice Department official, related to the negotiation of a deal between major automakers in the state of California over emissions standards. So they're getting a little more aggressive there and using their oversight powers. That Supreme Court ruling yesterday related to the rights of gays and transgender people in the workplace is going to have incredible ripple effects, particularly on the Trump administration's effort to eliminate transgender rights across the government in education, housing, the military, and last Friday, what appears to be an extra-legal effort to rewrite Obamacare to exclude trans people. So what is remarkable about this is that Trump was asked about this Monday afternoon. And he said that he is going to accept the Supreme Court's ruling. They've ruled, he said. I've read the decision. Really? And some people were surprised, but they've ruled, and we live with their decision. So will he back off on all of those efforts to discriminate against trans people? I don't know. Maybe it was just a way to pander to his base. Over at the CIA, they've been exposed again, this time as Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon releases a report that's been around for a while, and it relates to the loss of the hacking tools that are collectively known as Vault 7. And information about the tools was published by WikiLeaks back in March of 2017. And of course, one of those hacking tools would have enabled them to blame Russia for hacking the DNC and other similar sleights of hand, if you will. So the report by the CIA's WikiLeaks task force portrays an agency more concerned with bulking up its cyber arsenal than keeping those tools secure. Security procedures were woefully lax within the special unit that designed and built the tools. Now, there's a little bit of duplication here because I thought the Cyber Command over at the NSA was the lead agency on hacking, monitoring, surveilling foreign governments. So this is another black eye on the CIA, and absolutely nothing more will happen. You can be assured of that. Here's an illustration of the ugly and caustic campaign finance system we have in the United States today. Eliot Engel has been serving in Congress as a Democrat from New York for almost 30 years. He has drawn a credible challenge in the primary. And so he is collecting as much money as he can and lining up support from political action committees. So a super PAC run by Republicans and generating funds from Republicans called Americans for Tomorrow's Future is not dumping money directly into his campaign or into its own messaging efforts to support him. No, they're laundering the money through another super PAC called the Democratic Majority for Israel. This is the same outfit that ran negative ads about Bernie Sanders in the Democratic presidential primary. And they didn't actually hit Bernie over his position on Israel. They hammered him on Medicare for all. So the Democratic Majority for Israel, has spent more than $600,000 boosting Engel and hammering his opponent on television and with digital ads, mailers, and robocalls. And Jamal Bowman is his opponent, who has been taking most of that incoming flack. Engel is on the receiving end of nearly $1 million of outside big money and counting, including funding from 2 other dark money groups that so far have not been traced. And finally today, the rogue utility that keeps the lights on here at the secret studio, Pacific Gas and Electric Company, has once again pled guilty to manslaughter and gross negligence. They pled 84 separate times in court today guilty for the destruction of the town of Paradise in Butte County in 2018. It was their power line that was almost 100 years old and had not been replaced, that was blown off its tower and sparked the fire that destroyed the entire town and killed 84 people. And Bill Johnson, who was brought in to try to clean up this mess, and he's leaving as fast as he can, he is retiring after about 1 year of service at the end of this month. He said, "I'm here to take responsibility for the fire that killed these people. I've heard the pain and anguish. No words from me can ever reduce the magnitude of that devastation." And this is a company that's already on probation from the San Bruno gas pipeline explosion that killed, I believe, 8 people and destroyed some 25 to 35 homes about 12 years ago. It is expected that no executive will face jail time. The company will pay billions in settlements to the survivors of those it killed. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place, even at PG&E. You'll find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trail.